From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. My name is Jason Steinhauer. I'm a program specialist at the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. On behalf of the Kluge Center, welcome to the library. Before we begin today's program, I'll ask you to please take a moment and check your cell phones and other electronic devices, and please ensure that they are set to silent. I'll also take a moment to make you aware that this afternoon's program is being filmed for future placement on the Kluge Center's website, as well as on our YouTube and iTunes U channels. Today's lecture is presented by the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress in conjunction with the National History Center and the International Seminar on Decolonization. Now in its 10th and final year, the Decolonization Seminar brings 15 young scholars from around the world to Washington, D.C. for 4 weeks of research and discussion into the dissolution of colonial empires in the period after the Second World War and the emergence of new nations, particularly in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. In 10 years, the seminar has brought 150 emerging scholars from the Americas, Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and Africa to the Library of Congress to use the library's extraordinary global collections in 470 different languages, as well as other resources in Washington, D.C. for this research. We at the Kluge Center are delighted that our collections at the Library of Congress have informed this scholarship, and we are grateful to the National History Center to have been in cooperation on this seminar for now 10 years. Funding for the seminar is generously provided by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the seminar is organized and administered by the National History Center, whose mission is to reinforce the critical role that history and historical knowledge play in public decision-making and civic life. I encourage you to visit the National History Center's website to learn more about their important work. The successful collaboration for the past 10 years is a testament to the vision of the Kluge Center's founding director, Dr. Prosser Gifford, our recently retired director, Dr. Carolyn Brown, and Professor William Roger Lewis, a distinguished scholar of British history and the British Empire, a member of the Library of Congress Scholars Council, conceiver of the International Seminar on Decolonization, and who has directed the seminar each summer since 2006. And to him, we extend our sincere thanks. A word about the Kluge Center. The Kluge Center is a vibrant scholar center on Capitol Hill that brings together scholars and researchers from around the world to stimulate and energize one another, to distill wisdom from the library's rich resources, and to interact with policymakers and the public. The center offers opportunities for senior scholars, postdoctoral fellows, as well as PhD candidates to conduct research in the Library of Congress collections. We also offer free public lectures, conferences, symposia, and other programs, such as this one. And we administer the Kluge Prize, which recognizes lifetime achievement in the fields of the humanistic and social sciences, and which we will award in 2015, later this year. For more information about the center, please visit loc.gov/Kluge, K-L-U-G-E, and I invite you to sign up for our RSS email list on your way out to learn more about our future programs, as well as opportunities for you to conduct your own research here in the Library of Congress. And now it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Philippa Levine to the podium. Dr. Levine is the Professor Mary Helen Thompson Centennial Professor in the Humanities and co-director of the program in British Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She is a member of this year's Decolonization Seminar faculty, and she will introduce today's speaker.
It's a great pleasure and something of an honor to introduce today's speaker, not only because I'm such a great admirer of her work, but also because this is the very last speaker associated with the National History Center's International Seminar on Decolonization, now, as you've heard, in its 10th and final year. I can think of no one more fitting to send us out on a high intellectual note than Jordanna Bailkin, one of the most respected as well as storied British historians working in the US Academy today. Her influential work, with its insistence on understanding the impact of decolonization within Britain, as well as its far-flung colonies, has helped forge this field of study and to take it in profitable new directions. So it's a real pleasure to have her with us here today to share some of her new findings. Professor Bailkin teaches at the University of Washington in Seattle and is the author of two critically acclaimed books. The Culture of Property, The Crisis of Liberalism in Modern Britain, 2004, investigates Britain's cultural patrimony, showing the ways in which museum art reveals the politics of early 20th century Britain at a moment when the prospect of national decline was becoming alarmingly apparent. One reviewer called it a rich account of cultural politics. In The Afterlife of Empire, her most recent book in 2012, she moved to the post-war era, arguing persuasively that the process of decolonization critically shaped the post-war British welfare state, so persuasively, in fact, that the book won 3 prizes: the Maurice Forkosh Prize from the American Historical Association, the Stansky Book Prize from the North American Conference on British Studies, and the Biennial Book Prize from the Pacific Coast Conference on British Studies. It is a moving account of the effects of expert opinion and less than subtle racism on the lives of post-war migrants living in Britain. She speaks to us today about a slice of her new book project, which examines Britain's refugee and resettlement camps between the 1930s and the 1980s. Like The Afterlife of Empire, this work insists on the deep connections between welfare and empire. Today's talk is entitled Unsettled: Refugee Camps in Britain from the Suez Crisis to Idi Amin. Please join me in welcoming Jordanna Bailkin.
Thank you very much, Philippa, for that very kind introduction. It's a very great pleasure to be here today and to be part of the International Seminar on Decolonization. This has been such an amazing resource over the last 10 years for young scholars in this field, many of whom have gone on to be really pioneers in this field. So I'm really looking forward to our conversations this afternoon and ultimately hearing more about your work and all of the terrific research that's been going on here this summer. So what I want to do today is to reflect back on my last project, which I thought I had finished, but of course it hadn't really finished with me, it turns out. And I also want to share some of my new project, which is still taking shape. So Philippa mentioned my recent book, The Afterlife of Empire, which looked at how decolonization changed social relationships in Britain, partly by helping to change the structures of welfare. And I focused particularly on 3 domains of welfare: mental health, childcare, and criminal law, because these were 3 areas of welfare that were especially influenced by imperial decline. So my aim in that book was to take what have really always been these 2 behemoths of post-1945 history, the end of empire on the one hand and the welfare state on the other, which have always really been kept quite radically separate and isolated from one another. And I wanted, in The Afterlife of Empire, to bring them into conversation and to think about their mutual influence as well as their archival intimacy. So I was trying to understand how welfare in Britain was never really just a domestic creation or a metropolitan creation, but rather it was always something that was shaped by global forces. Forces like the new legal regimes that were emerging in independent Asia and independent Africa, and the expectations of those regimes that migrants were bringing with them to Britain. The idea was that in using this global prism to think about Britain in the 1950s and 60s, we could explain the ambitions of the welfare state, but also we could start to explain its fragilities and its unevenness. Now, many of the questions that drove that book have stayed with me. And in particular, there's one conclusion that I really haven't been able to let go of. And that is the idea that I came to, that Britain's engagement with its former colonies was actually intensified by independence rather than lessened by it. So how do we talk about that process of intensification? If we think about the available terminology, for example, the neo-colonial, that doesn't really capture the complexity of the relationships that I'm interested in and all the different forms of alliance and solidarity that were starting to multiply in the post-independence period. So I'm still exploring in this new project the personal entanglements that were galvanized by independence. And I'm trying to give those entanglements a richer vocabulary and a richer conceptual and archival apparatus. So that's part of the new project that I'll be talking about today. The plan for this new book, which is called Unsettled, is to look at resettlement and reception camps that were set up all over England and Scotland and Wales. They were set up for Jewish and Basque refugees in the 1930s, for Polish refugees in the 1940s, Hungarians and Anglo-Egyptians in the 50s, Ugandan Asians in the 70s, and refugees from Vietnam in the 1980s. So altogether, I'm looking at around 60 camps, and they range from the heart of London all the way to the most remote corners of North Wales. These camps serve tens of thousands of refugees. They engage thousands of civil servants, and they hosted a fractious mix of volunteers, ex-army officers and colonial servants, middle-class matrons, and also young radicals. Some camps were very tightly controlled, with barbed wire perimeters and armed guards. At other camps, residents came and left freely. Some camps were completely ignored by locals, while others transformed the nature of nearby towns. People could be encamped for just a few days or for decades. And so it's that diversity of experience that I want to capture in the book. The story of refugee camps in Britain is part of a larger story of the genealogies of multiculturalism, allowing us to ask new questions about how and when multicultural Britain emerged. Multiculturalism in Britain has often been narrated as a numbers game that operates by assessing which groups were easier or more difficult for Britons to digest and why. This approach has prioritized post-war waves of larger minority groups, and I'm putting waves here in quotation marks, such as South Asians and West Indians who have imperial connections. And I think this is emblematized in the slogan of many activists of color in Britain, "We are here because you were there." This particular poster, this is from a protest about persecution and sexual abuse taking place at Yarl's Wood, which is an immigration detention center in Bedfordshire. What happens if we resist this fetish and the reductive chronology of waves of arrival? One premise of this book is that resettlement was in fact deeply unsettling, not only for refugees, but also for those Britons who worked at or lived near the camps. I am also trying to unsettle some of the key narratives of British history that depend on a division of hosts, migrants, and refugees. So I'm using these camps to think about how Britons saw their place in the world across very different moments: the interwar and Second World War, the Cold War, the last gasp of formal imperialism, and a new internationalism that was both embraced by Thatcherism and constrained by it. The diverse populations that flowed in and out of British refugee camps demonstrate that multiculturalism in Britain was not only a post-colonial story, but also a global one that hinged on the fate of multiple European and American empires and the trajectories of Cold Wars and Hot Wars. Taken together, these 60 camps illuminate the instability of welfarism and its unpredictable relationship to local and global transformations. Now, I use this phrase, taken together, because I want to ask what we learn by placing all of these refugee stories in conversation with one another. One of the first things that interested me in this project was that many of the camps I look at were repurposed and recycled for different groups. So the Hungarians and the Anglo-Egyptians were competing for spaces with one another when they arrived at the same moment in 1956. More surprisingly, when the Ugandan Asians arrived in the 70s, they found Poles in some of their camps who were still encamped from 3 decades earlier. So there's a layering of populations within the camps. Also, and this was perhaps one of the biggest surprises to me so far in my research, I learned that refugees almost always shared their camps with Britons who were displaced by war and poverty. Some were there officially, but many camps were also invaded by British squatters. In this sense, what we think of as refugee camps were actually never only for refugees. Now, most camps were located in former military bases. So this one is a Polish camp in southwest England, Daglingworth. This means that the camps are part of the material culture of both warfare and welfare. Refugee work meshed with debates about modernization and urban planning, demilitarization and remilitarization, tower blocks and new towns, squatting, slums, and ghettoization, and homes and homelessness. So what I want to do today is to pick out one thread of this bigger story. And I want to talk about 2 particular groups of refugees and their camps, 2 sets of refugees who were created specifically by the end of empire. So that is the Anglo-Egyptians, British subjects who were expelled from Egypt during the Suez crisis of 1956, and Ugandan Asians, also British subjects who were expelled by Idi Amin's Africanization policies in 1972. Now, there are a lot of reasons to compare the Anglo-Egyptians and the Ugandan Asians. First of all, they were actually structurally intertwined. So the Uganda Resettlement Board, which is the main aid agency in 1972, this was modeled explicitly on the Anglo-Egyptian Resettlement Board. Both groups were seen as being displaced by British action, although that link was much more explicit for the Anglo-Egyptians. So Anglo-Egyptians were really seen as the helpless victims of British military intervention. Britain's role in the Ugandan crisis was seen in much deeper historical terms, going back to the British export of South Asian labor in the 18th century. One of the crucial differences between these groups is that the British state indemnified the property of Anglo-Egyptians after they were expelled, while Ugandan Asians did not receive that protection. What this meant for both groups is that their camps in Britain became crucial sites of class formation. Immigration history abounds with tropes of reversals of fortune and the frustrations of downward mobility suffered in diaspora: degrees not recognized, work experiences devalued, skills ignored due to prejudice and protectionism. I think what's striking here is how the decolonizing state intervened in these stories, and not always in expected directions, sometimes producing upwards mobility as well as the reverse. In the United States, immigration authorities assumed that refugees would become part of the working poor. But refugee camps in Britain were much more varied, at times proposing that refugees would naturally align with migrants from their own ethnic background and contribute to the formation of an urban underclass, but also sometimes depicting refugees as model minorities who were superior to other migrants, especially other migrants of color. The British state's fantasies clashed with the realities of diverse refugee populations. At the same time, these fantasies were hugely powerful in creating new realities. By providing aid to restore some, but not all, refugees to the class positions Britons imagined they had held elsewhere, the camps became a focal point in shaping refugees' futures. So let me speak first about the Anglo-Egyptians. With British military intervention in Egypt underway by November of 1956, many British subjects were evacuated with the troops from Port Said. More were then evicted by the Egyptian government. The Anglo-Egyptians were British subjects, but mostly not English-speaking. The majority spoke French, Greek, Italian, or Arabic. Of the 7,000 or 8,000 who arrived in Britain, about half were Maltese, and most had never been to Britain before. In an article titled "British, but Many Strange to Britain," The Manchester Guardian reported on these bewildered populations that made up something called the Anglo-Egyptians. They included a retired English engineer who could not take his assets out of Egypt, a young Maltese accountant with his pretty wife, and 6 students from the Gold Coast of Africa who had been attending Cairo University before they were expelled. Others included Mrs. Gentles, a 66-year-old woman, German by birth, who had been employed in Egypt as a secretary. While there, she married a Scotsman in Egypt's Ministry of Education, and she too was now counted as part of this strange group called Anglo-Egyptian. The Anglo-Egyptian Resettlement Board was created in February of 1957. By August, the board was spending £200,000 per month to keep the Anglo-Egyptians housed and fed. The Prime Minister was cheered when he called their expulsion an illegal act for which Anglo-Egyptians must be compensated. But what does that mean, to compensate them? The idea of compensation had appeared nowhere else in British refugee work since Loyalist grants after the American Revolution. Welfare for Anglo-Egyptians was constructed not so much in terms of economic need, but through this idea of restoring people to their former position. These terms were linked to the board's understanding of status in Egypt's colonial milieu and the fall these people were imagined to suffer when they landed in Britain. A great deal of the work that refugee aid workers did was trying to calculate precisely the extent of this downward mobility and halt it, measuring the loss of status and dignity as well as financial humiliation. When the Anglo-Egyptians arrived in Britain, they registered their assets with the Foreign Office. In July of 1957, the government announced a £4 million scheme of loans against those registered assets, plus another £2 million in direct payments for relief and rehabilitation. These grants included personal allowances for clothing, housing, furnishing, and grants to establish new businesses. So clearly this is much more than emergency aid. One of the most striking points was that the emerging structures of British welfare were deemed wholly inadequate to the Anglo-Egyptian cause. Anglo-Egyptians were to be kept distinct from poor Britons. The Anglo-Egyptian Aid Society argued that refugees could not live on national assistance because they were, quote, unaccustomed to life in England, which does permit poor natives to live on those rates. Anglo-Egyptians were assisted not only as if they deserved more than other refugees, but also as if they were worthy of higher payments than impoverished Britons. Some pleaded that Anglo-Egyptians should, quote, never fall upon the normal machinery for the relief of hardship, especially if they enjoyed a formerly high standard of living. The Home Office said, although we are instructed to pay according to need, the needs of these people, the Anglo-Egyptians, may be greater than those of long-term residents here who have fallen into distress. At stake here was the question of how refugees fit or fail to fit into existing welfare regimes. Could refugees be restored to the same way of life in Britain they had enjoyed in Egypt? For the board to differentiate recipients of its aid on the basis of something called former standing was very difficult, and yet that was precisely what the board was asked to do. One board member objected that Anglo-Egyptians were not unique in falling on bad times through no fault of their own. Indeed, he said, most Britons who required national assistance could be thought of in the same way. Many Britons had to make what he called considerable mental adjustments if their financial circumstances suddenly changed. Why then, he said, should it be thought of as humiliating for Anglo-Egyptians to turn to national assistance? And why should this emerging form of help be seen as pathetically inadequate for them when it served so many Britons? The truth was that within this diverse population of Anglo-Egyptians, only some of them were targeted for aid. The Anglo-Egyptian Aid Society focused on those who, if they had remained in Egypt, would have enjoyed prosperous careers and retirements. The loan scheme sought to preserve the position of older, affluent Anglo-Egyptian men. Poorer subjects of Maltese origin were actually seen as better off in Britain than if they had remained in Egypt, and they received significantly less assistance. Now, the Home Office has a collection of files on grants for Anglo-Egyptians, and I think they point to the range of individuals who were involved in this scheme. One recipient was Mrs. C.C. Sammy, age 63. British by birth, Mrs. Sammy had married an Egyptian, but never forfeited her British nationality. Her husband was a senior official in the Egyptian Ministry of Agriculture. He died in 1943 and left his wife an estate of £15,000. In 1945, Mrs. Sammy left Egypt for her health, and she came to Britain. She lived there on the interest from her assets in Egypt, plus a widow's pension of £18 a month from the Egyptian government. Her assets were frozen in 1956, leaving her sole income the £18 that she now received from the Resettlement Board in lieu of her Egyptian pension. As a result of this downturn, Mrs. Sammy moved from a comfortable flat to an unfurnished room in Hove, borrowing a bed, a chair, and one small table. And her caseworker details this downturn in very heartrending fashion. Her caseworker wrote, quote, "Her present position is thoroughly humiliating. One surely cannot expect a woman who has held a high social position in Egypt to grovel in a slum for £4 a week." Now, part of what I think is so interesting about her case is that Mrs. Sammy had been living in Britain since 1945, so she's not a refugee in any traditional sense. But neither could the board consider her successfully settled. The case rested on not only defining who was a refugee, but also trying to figure out who had been socially impacted by Britain's imperial crisis, and thus should become an object of special aid instead of the normal welfare machinery. Now, in watching cases like this, the Maltese, many of whom were Sephardic Jews, were deeply embittered by the inequities of the aid process. Victor Leonardo, who was a spokesman for the Maltese residents at the Eastwood camp, said he felt in his heart that the government should, quote, "compensate morally as well as materially all refugees from Egypt with a lump sum of cash." Regarding the chance of national assistance, which he was offered, Leonardo replied, quote, "We would rather like to have our own money lost in Egypt than to live in charity, not forgetting that our hostel is more like a concentration camp than anything else." Lord Colton, who was then chair of the Resettlement Board, responded that he could only deal with the temporary problem of immediate distress. He said it was not in his power to pay refugees a percentage of assets they had left behind. But in fact, we've seen with Mrs. Sammy that the board just did exactly that. So the distinction between resettlement and compensation broke down all the time, resting on the board's calibration of social standing and long-term connections to Britain. Within this very capacious category of Anglo-Egyptian, those defined as Maltese could receive emergency resettlement aid, but not compensation. Compensation was reserved for those of white English descent. By 1972, when the Ugandan Asians started to arrive, this notion of compensation had disappeared. Of the 28,000 Ugandan Asians who came to Britain, almost 22,000 of them went through resettlement camps. Now, I have a few photographs of the Ugandan Asian arrival, and I just want to say a couple things about these photographs. So I have discovered a very few pictures of Ugandan Asians actually in the camps themselves, and they are mostly like these kind of blurry snapshots, mostly personal snapshots like this one, which is from Heathfield Camp. These are not the images that were circulating most widely in the British media in 1972. The media really fetishizes two particular moments: the flight from Uganda and the arrival in Britain. And I think for most Britons who remember the Ugandan Asian crisis, partly what they remember, at least based on people that I've spoken with, are these images of thousands of people camped out in airports, right? So they're images of mass embarkations and mass debarkations. I think this is really important because these are pictures that have been used in a very particular political way, and that is to entrench a myth of emergency and to stage an image of unanticipated chaos. The British state's insistence on this image produced a lot of very real chaos, in turn, for people who were moving through the camps. One way that this manufacturing of emergency was maintained was by treating each refugee crisis in Britain as unique and upholding the fiction that each situation was new, it was unprecedented, and it was the result of a temporary crisis that was foreign and external to Britain. So part of what I hope to do in sketching out these connections between various episodes of refugee arrival, and also focusing on a longer period of encampment rather than just this very short moment of arrival, is I want to challenge this rubric in which each refugee crisis was reinvented anew. And I also want to ask whose interests were served by treating these episodes as completely discontinuous. Now, most scholars begin the story of the Ugandan Asian crisis on a particular date, which is August 5th, 1972. So this is the day that the Ugandan leader, Amin, announced that all Asian holders of British passports would be repatriated. This is the term he used. So they would be repatriated to Britain, and they would be expelled from Uganda within 90 days. So it was over the next 3 months that 28,000 Ugandan Asians landed in Britain. So it seems like a very rapid process. What I want to point out is that the prospect that this would happen and that newly independent African countries might expel their Asian populations, that is a fear we can see in British documents as early as the 1950s. So if we look at Home Office files from the late 50s, you can see British officials starting to talk about this possibility, that they were going to have to shelter the descendants of the same Asians they had led from India to Africa in the 18th century. And they called this, quote, only the latest of a series of unavoidable capitulations. The expulsion of the Ugandan Asians was not a sudden revelation born of the incoherent ravings of Idi Amin, though that's very much what the contemporary British press suggested. Instead, it was a long anticipated and very much dreaded consequence of decolonization, British awareness of which had developed over several decades, not several months. And I think you would never know that from looking at these pictures, which again are images very much of a short-term crisis, a crisis that begins abruptly and without warning, and which will be speedily resolved. So I hope in fleshing out the life of the camps to really work against that myth of emergency, because it's a myth that haunts not only the Ugandan Asian story, but it haunts many other refugee stories as well. Altogether, there were 16 camps for Ugandan Asians, costing the British government £1 million per month to run. Some of the camps were physically attractive, with married quarters and plentiful supplies of games, while others were chaotic and unhygienic. Arun Sakaria, who was a taxi driver, spoke fondly of his lovely camp in Sussex, where English families took him out every weekend. At Hemswell, his next camp, he was bored and lonely. Atul Patel, who I interviewed last summer, experienced a grim stay at Honiton camp, but then was happily moved to an American Air Force base in Faldingworth. At Faldingworth, luxury was evident everywhere, from the comfortably padded chairs to the high-quality crockery and central heating, like a hotel, he said. Patel recalled, of course, them being Americans, this was posh. We were living in wooden huts in Honiton, and here was concrete and cement. Fantastic colors, and he talked about how every room at Faldingworth was painted a different color, which was very different from Honiton, which was all gray, basically, with a little green. So fantastic colors, fantastic facilities, bars, canteens, that we hadn't seen before, snooker tables. So you can imagine what Faldingworth was like. It was a Butlin's holiday, he said. Now, at the other end of the spectrum was Tomfenau Camp, located in a bleak corner of Welsh-speaking North Wales. Miles from any industrial center, with a high rate of unemployment, squeezed between mountains and the stormy Irish Sea, the camp was marked by a barbed wire fence and a sign that said, "Beware of the firing range." Most job interviews were 6 hours away by train. Hundreds of Ugandan Asians huddled here over heaters amid wartime wooden sheds, all of which had been deserted by the army 3 years earlier. The camp leader, Captain Freddie Fuller, had spent 25 years as a warden of an outward bound school. He claimed the residents here, the Ugandan Asian residents, had what he called the advantages of a rural life. They are not overtaken by the milling masses, which is certainly true. His critics, he said, focused only on the need for bricks and mortar and overlooked what he called the joy of the place. But one might ask, whose joy was it? Most of the town's 4,500 inhabitants turned out to greet the Ugandans on arrival. It was, as one journalist said, and this is something you'll hear echoed again and again in the local press, the most exciting thing to have happened for years. Volunteers started a camp newspaper called Communicore, which the Asian residents neither contributed to nor read, while the staff refused to provide the daily newspapers that carried job advertisements. The library, which was open for 90 minutes daily, housed an eclectic selection, a memoir of Modigliani, an 1856 French edition of La Fontaine's Fables, J. Paul Getty's autobiography, My Life and Fortune. The Welsh middle classes happily adopted the camp shop as their local delicatessen, while white volunteers ate their meat and two veg in their own separate canteen, discussing the problems of racial integration. Here we can see refugee camps as sites not only of a deeply flawed humanitarianism, but also of cosmopolitanism. As Asians in other camps went on hunger strike to protest the quality of the food and racial segregation in the dining halls, the Welsh dined out here to enjoy exotic treats. Now, one reason these camps were so oddly placed was to try to encourage settlement out of so-called red areas, that is, cities with large immigrant populations, or cities that were perceived to have excessively large immigrant populations. And the effort was supposed to direct camp residents into green areas of so-called low immigrant population. This strategy was remarkably and completely unsuccessful. The bizarre choice of camp locations should be seen as part of a failed technology of managing and imagining race relations. But before the Ugandan Asians even arrived, one key myth was firmly in place. The Ugandan Asians were all highly anglicized and fundamentally bourgeois. The Observer quoted one young Ugandan Asian as saying that he had always only learned English in school. Quote, "In fact, I failed Gujarati. I did Macbeth, I did Dickens, I did Tennyson. I was never taught Indian history, but the history of the British Empire only." The ambition of this group, the British press agreed, was to join the property-owning democracy, a semi-detached house in the suburbs, their cherished ideal. Such families would recoil from the, quote, ghetto life into which Indians, Pakistanis, and West Indians had been forced in the 50s and 60s. The Observer happily concluded, quote, "What is coming now is a middle-class invasion." These predictions shaped all of the provisions for Ugandan Asians in camp. While Anglo-Egyptians were expected to need housing for months, the assumption was that the Ugandan Asians would all leave the camps in 1 or 2 days. The Times noted a shortage of interpreters in the Ugandan Asian camps, which the administrators flatly denied, wedded as they were to the idea that all Ugandan Asians spoke English. In reality, the journalist argued, quote, "Their English is often not good enough to explain the more complicated problems with which their expulsion has faced them." By December of 1972, the Department of Employment was forced to admit that up to 20% and probably more of Ugandan Asians actually needed language training. These frustrated expectations led to overcrowding and worsening conditions in the camps. Women volunteers in particular complained that these refugees were indistinguishable from the, quote, shabby Indian and Pakistani workers who were already in Britain, and in no way resembled the group of gifted and genteel professionals that the Home Office had led the English to expect. The difficulty of interpreting the class of Ugandan Asians would become one of the failures of social science during this period. Like many kinds of camps in Europe after the Second World War, British camps served as laboratories for social science. But rather than the army of psychologists, nutritionists, and social workers who staffed continental camps, new experts emerged in Britain. In particular, labor specialists conducted countless interviews with Ugandan Asians to try to identify suitable candidates for small business loans. This was very much in keeping with the media image of the Ugandan Asian as the entrepreneurial self-starter. Indeed, the mythology of the Ugandan Asian as the model minority originated in the camps, even as the logic of decisions to assist or refuse individuals could be very difficult to parse. These interviews are a key archive of camp life, one of the few detailed records of loss and dispossession that Ugandan Asians had suffered. Such files tell us, of course, as much about their creators as their subjects, but they also highlight what was suppressed at the time, the socioeconomic diversity of the refugees. Interviewees were asked about their length of residence in Uganda, their relatives and friends, if they had any, in Britain, their educational and occupational history, the newspapers they read and the sports they played, and their fluency in English. Very few claims about net worth in Uganda could be verified, which made assessments of character and capability all the more important. One 42-year-old West Malling resident was described as having, quote, no really definable skills or knowledge, despite working in his father's tailoring shop for 20 years as a bookkeeper. The interviewer noted derisively under interests that the man was, quote, very status conscious. His, I think, quite legitimate fear that it would be difficult to establish a business in England without financial backing was also derided as a lack of motivation. Interviewers were more willing to invest in younger men, which is an interesting contrast with the Anglo-Egyptians, even if they lacked capital and work experience. For a 57-year-old at Greenham Camp who had worked in the family business, the interviewer wrote, quote, suspect older brother always played leading role in management, does not appear to have been involved in establishment of any aspect of business, bought from older generation. The interviewee claimed that his brother was bringing money from India, but the interviewer wrote, vague, sounds like hope only. The man was described as a poor investment prospect, recommended for light factory work and Social Security. Another candidate with a successful business selling cloth to Africans was dismissed because he relied too heavily on the African market. He was also recommended for factory work and turned down for a loan. Businessmen were discredited if they had employed cheap African labor, which was unavailable in Britain. But most of all, candidates were assessed by the way they lived in the camps themselves, that is, whether they took part in the leadership of the camp or rebelled against it. One of the most powerful and one of the only published accounts of camp life was Mahmoud Mamdani's 1973 memoir, From Citizen to Refugee. Mamdani charted his harrowing experiences at Kensington Barracks Camp in a fashionable quarter of London. Run by a former colonial servant, the camp exemplified to Mamdani, now a political scientist at Columbia, a colonialist belief in natural hierarchy. Job information at the camp was tightly controlled, and housing details given only to those who reported on their fellow residents. On the surface, life in the British camp presented a favorable contrast to the open terror of living in Uganda. But, Mamdani said, it was the Kensington camp and not Amin's Uganda, which was his first experience in living in a totalitarian society. Mamdani described how he left the camp for excursions, but realized, quote, it wasn't such a nice feeling to walk up and down Kensington High Street among people who seemed to be buying things just about all the time. Our resources were limited to Social Security payments of £2.10 a week. With such a meager income, buying anything was out of the question. But all around us was incessant consumption, staring at us from every window were things just waiting to be bought, to be eaten, to be worn, to be read. As he put it memorably, though rather profanely, looking at life on Kensington High Street seemed, quote, like seeing the city through its asshole. Now, my point is not to reinforce Mamdani's narrative, but it's to consider how camp residents were facing critiques from multiple directions. not only from right-wing anti-immigrationists, not surprising at all, but also from activists of color who saw refugee camps as failed sites of identity formation and radicalization. The Trinidadian writer Shiva Nepal, a brother of V.S. Nepal, the novelist, denounced Asian camp residents in Britain as ridiculously optimistic, eager to mix up with the British and turn their backs on Indian and African nationalist politics. For Nepal, the disengagement and fatalism that he thought had led Asians to accept their British passports in the first place was now culminating in the refugee camps, the ultimate flowering of Asian dependence on Britain and acceptance of their own Asian undesirability. This project is about camps in Britain, but it's also about the erasure of camps from public consciousness. And this is one aspect of the project that I found fascinating, is that the memory of all of these camps is completely absent in Britain today. British participation in European camps is well known, and I think regarded with a lot of pride. The fact that the British had brutal detention centers in their colonies is much more recently and more reluctantly acknowledged. But camps are understood as something that happened elsewhere. What's been totally forgotten is the fact that there were dozens of camps operating in Britain itself. This forgetting highlights the complexity of what was gained and what was lost at the end of empire, and by whom. To revisit our two groups, the Anglo-Egyptians, the Ugandan Asians, by 1959, British subjects leaving Egypt were no longer called refugees. So that's a term that has a very short shelf life for that group. Now they were simply distressed British subjects thrown back on the mechanisms of welfare. Their material traces in camps were erased as the Prisons Commission purchased Anglo-Egyptian camps for their own use. For the Ugandan Asians, too, the work of forgetting encampment was linked to other forms of detention. By the end of 1973, these camps had been forcibly emptied of their Asian residents. One of the most prominent camps, Stratishal, became a prison. Many others became detention centers for illegal immigrants, the infrastructure for a new security state. The life of these structures as camps was erased, and Ugandan Asians were celebrated as successful strivers. The Anglo-Egyptians appear to receive much more in terms of financial aid. And perhaps even more striking than the amount of aid was the way it was conceived, as compensation for the past. And yet, hardly anyone knows who the Anglo-Egyptians are today, and they play no part in contemporary discourses of multicultural Britain. It's easy, I think, to perceive this unevenness in this talk in that I've shown you no photographs of the Anglo-Egyptians. That's because I haven't found any. So the media coverage of the Suez crisis is really all about young British soldiers shipping out. It's not about who's coming in. And we know this is not just about wider use of photography later in the 20th century, because in fact the Basques and the Poles were very heavily photographed in the 1930s and the 1940s. And I wanted to show you just a couple of those photographs. This is one of my favorites. So this is a picture of Basque boys and English boys together at the Stoneham refugee camp. And the influx of Basque refugees and Basque children into Britain was very much tied to debates about delinquency in Britain, adolescent delinquency, and the infiltration of Basque camps by British teenagers and what kind of misbehavior might be going on in the camps. There are also a lot of photographs of Poles, and especially of one thing that we see a lot of media coverage of is Catholic rituals in Polish refugee camps. So there are quite a few pictures of camp residents taking communion or celebrating Corpus Christi. So I think this is an interesting question. Why are some camps photographed so much more than others? I think these disparities are really about who is considered an identifiable population. No one thinks of the Anglo-Egyptians as a group, whereas Ugandan Asians have been amalgamated into, quote, normal migration regimes, a feat of political mobilization and myth of a unified community that the Anglo-Egyptians did not realize. If the Ugandan Asians speedily became the model minority, then the Anglo-Egyptians never became a minority at all. Many of the refugees that I'm investigating have generated voluminous historiographies. It's not as if there's been no work done on these groups. It's their life in camps, specifically, that's been forgotten. And the effect of that forgetting is to keep refugees locked in their separate ethnic groups, and to focus on the success and failure debates that accompanied their arrival. How well did Hungarians adjust to democracy? How well did Ugandan Asians prosper in business? How quickly would the Vietnamese learn English? Rather than adding to the literature on any one of these populations, I want to think about what all of their encampments reveal about unknown elements of British history. What were Britons trying to create in these camps? And how did their fantasies and anxieties play out in lived experience? How did the camps forge different kinds of unity and disunity, transforming the identities of the people who lived in and near them? And what kinds of interactions and intimacies and frictions did they generate? I want to end by offering a larger point about the structure of the book. The book is guided by the argument that refugees should not be siloed off from one another, nor from the key themes of 20th century British history. And that is why the book is structured thematically rather than by group. Each chapter focuses on a specific set of camps, placing the different people who inhabited them and the bodies of scholarship they generated into conversation. This is a way to see how their stories were intertwined at the level of material culture and local history, but also how policies changed over time in the same place, favoring family reunions in camps for the Vietnamese, but not for Poles, for example, or coping with different forms of resistance. And I think one interesting contrast is that the Basques refused to stay in their camp while the Poles refused to leave. So they generate kind of different problems for camp administrators. In the book, I cross identitarian categories by focusing on the spaces that all of these groups moved through and where they were in conversation with one another, the built environment of encampment. And just to give you an example of the kind of space I'm working with, this is a Nissen hut, and we saw rows of these in the first slide of the Polish camp. The Nissen hut is perhaps the most recognizable structure of refugee camps in Britain. It was invented during the First World War by an American-born engineer, Peter Nissen, who later became a British citizen. And it was used not only for many different groups of refugees, but also to house demobbed servicemen, paramilitary prisoners in Northern Ireland, and university students. The huts provided a link between these seemingly disparate populations, visually aligning their shared, though unequal, experiences of mobility and displacement. The Nissen hut reveals the convergence of Britons and refugees rather than their isolation from one another. I think what camps allow us to do is to see this proximity of individuals and groups that scholars have kept separate. Not only hosts and migrants, but also refugee populations across ethnicity and across time. They take us beyond the conventional terms of migration history in Britain and its frames of arrival, dispersal, disillusionment, prejudice, adaptation, assimilation. All analytic lenses developed as these refugees arrived and which have proved remarkably durable. In this sense, camps have the power to disrupt the dominance of migration as the primary mode of thinking about difference in 20th century British history, disorienting its structures and its chronologies, and I hope bringing different moments and different players into focus. Thank you.
Jordanna very kindly agreed to take questions, so I'll let her do her.
Yes.
Thank you very much for this. Alana Feldman, I teach at George Washington. And I have a question actually about the category of the refugee and really about how important that category and figuring out that category was or wasn't here. I was very interested in the populations that you focused on today, in some ways, are the sort of mirror opposite of what the category in terms of international law is meant to, or describes, in that they haven't lost the protection of their nationality. They've lost the protection of the space in which they were making a life and a home that was actually not their nationality, or getting incorporated into where they have national citizenship but no settlement or home. And so, but other populations that you're looking at in this project are more classic refugee populations. So my question is just, does that matter? How much does that matter to the policymakers and to the planners as they're thinking about these populations? Does it matter to them that where and how they fit into this category? And also, to the extent that you have evidence of this, how much does that matter to these populations that they're this kind of dissonance?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And one of the important choices I made in thinking about which groups to focus on was that I wanted to bring together groups who were British subjects and those who were not, for precisely that reason, to see what difference it made to policymakers and to local populations, and how their aid was thought about. And I think it matters very much, but probably the first thing I should say is that many of the populations in this book do not accept the definition of themselves as refugees, right? So both in oral histories and in archival work that I've done, you see a lot of alternative vocabularies being generated, especially by the Anglo-Egyptians and by the Ugandan Asians, but also by the Poles, who prefer to call themselves displaced and not refugees. So the British government is perhaps the sloppiest, I would say, in using the term refugee very, very widely. All different departments of the state, that's true. The Anglo-Egyptians, in the documents I've looked at, refer to themselves as evacuees rather than refugees. And I think that is a very meaningful distinction. It's not a distinction that the state is making about them, but it's a distinction that they make about themselves. And it's really with the Ugandan Asian influx in 1972 that the term refugee camp is dropped and they get renamed resettlement centers, precisely because spokespeople for the Ugandan Asian community make it clear that they find the term refugee very offensive. You know, British camp administrators continue to use it very widely throughout the 70s, but according to at least some Ugandan Asians who I've interviewed, it's interesting as we'll speak for a long time about being in what I will call a refugee camp, because I don't really like the euphemism of resettlement center, and we'll be talking for a long time, and then sort of as I'm leaving, I've had this happen with 4 or 5 different people, where people have said to me, you can call it a refugee camp, but we weren't really refugees. The people in it weren't really refugees. And I think in Britain there's a particularly complicated ecology of these camps and mixing, in that there are Britons living in them too, sometimes because they themselves have been displaced, and sometimes because they're volunteers who have moved in. So one thing that people I've interviewed have really made clear to me is they want me to be aware of that diversity of populations within the camp, and I think that is really important. So certainly the introduction to the book will need to spell out a very important distinction between a legal definition of a refugee, a social definition that's happening, and then competing and alternative ways to talk about these experiences of displacement and mobility that don't use the term refugee at all. I think those are really important.
Sonia Michelle from the University of Maryland. This is really fascinating on many different levels. I have a couple of questions. One is, to what extent were they at all, the administrators of the camp, self-conscious about not replicating Nazi camps? Were they thinking about, it wasn't that long from that history, so was that sort of in the back of their mind? And second, this strikes me as a very mid-century kind of project or program, in a way that, in other words, social science and all the behavioral sciences and so forth are being brought to bear on the policies and the treatment and the way the camps are being organized on the one hand, but also it's a kind of, as you said, it was a research site. So it's kind of a controlled experiment. What's interesting in the whole sort of trajectory of welfare history is that throughout, I'm sure you know this, throughout the 20th century, there was a move away from institutions. Although, like Lydia Murdoch talks a lot about kids being put into institutions, but that was earlier in the 20th century. So this is a time when there's more deinstitutionalization. But in a way, these are like perfect. They're perfect places. I mean, you can control or there's an attempt at least to control the environment, which obviously the inhabitants, inmates, denizens, whatever you want to call them, were resisting in different ways. But, I just wonder what you think about that. And also, have you thought about comparing them to, I was thinking about the Japanese detention camps in the U.S. during the war, but of course they were meant to be punitive. And also, was a penological, way of thinking or approach invoked or brought to bear in any way, even though they weren't meant to be punitive, they were meant to be rescue and protection, but it's sort of inevitable when you're treating large groups of people that some kinds of restrictions and regulations are going to kick in. Anyway, looking forward to hearing more about this.
Yeah, thank you. I'll start with the penological model. And one thing that's become clear to me, I mentioned briefly the diversity of experience in these camps. I mean, individual camp wardens have tremendous power in this situation to define policies. So let's say for the Poles in their camps and hostels, they are administered first by the War Office during the war itself and the tail end of the war, and then by the National Assistance Board, which is really a new entity at that moment. So, it's very interesting to me that a lot of the agencies that are predominant in the history of welfare, this is really their first big challenge, is what to do with refugees and also how to think about them in relation to Britons in need. So the National Assistance Board has, quite clear policies about things like how to punish refugees who break the rules of the camp or hostel. But individual wardens don't necessarily abide by those policies. So there are a lot of instances of residence committees, in this case mostly Polish men, who organize themselves and have kind of grassroots protest movements against these wardens, saying, we might as well be in Russia, we might as well still be at war. And those evocations of concentration camps certainly get repeated throughout the period I'm looking at. Memdani says, his camp is like Bergen-Belsen, so he makes those comparisons. I think that it's never the intention of the National Assistance Board or any kind of major state agency to make these camps punitive, but the fact is they're people interacting in very intimate ways, and some wardens establish much more generous policies than the board intended around feeding practices and around cohabitation for unmarried couples. So you get wardens kind of going rogue and departing from the real sort of male breadwinner model of the welfare state and saying, oh, well, actually what I see in my camp is the women are better workers than the men, so we might as well let the women decide whether their husbands live with them or not. They're very interesting kind of interventions in Polish family life and sexual life that specific wardens make, again, without the oversight of the National Assistance Board. And sometimes you'll see a disciplinary letter in those follows saying, that warden was fired or more often moved around to another camp. So I don't think they're not punitive in their intent, but they certainly can wind up being punitive in their effects. And I think very influential in their effects in the way that I talked about today of just shaping people's opportunities. There are ways in which staying in a camp can be very beneficial. So for the Ugandan Asians, their children get school places if they're in camp in a way that they can't if they move directly into a community where they would be much more hampered by a local authority. So there are certain kinds of benefits, but there are enormous struggles that take place around, which kind of housing someone is put into. I mentioned this thing about the Poles won't leave and the Basques won't stay. The Ugandan Asians are very interesting in this way of refusing and deferring housing assignments much longer than expected. So this expectation that, they'll just be here for a couple of days, which is based on the British media's and to some extent the state's assumption that there's such a big Asian community everyone will stick together and their houses will be offered immediately to these people as soon as they arrive. And there's sort of a British, like, well, they're all related anyway, right? The family units are so big. And so with this one family coming in, someone will come to the camp and get them in a couple of days. And that doesn't happen. And what happens instead is a much more complicated negotiation, often between an individual family and the Uganda Resettlement Board, with people saying, I won't go to this area, I won't go to that area. What happens a lot is people saying, I won't take housing that's intended for a single person because I'm not single and my family is coming soon from Uganda or from India. And it's a very successful kind of manipulation of a housing offer that many other people are not able to pull off. And it's a very gendered one. I think that the most vivid example I've seen is women who enter Britain when their husbands are stateless, and the husbands have to stay in European transit camps, which are very much like prisons. And those women mount a very successful campaign in the British press to say, we're without our male breadwinner. We can't be expected to move out of the camp because, we can't earn a living on our own. And they are kept in camp much longer than anyone anticipated, and their husbands are allowed to enter Britain, about 200 or 300 men who are stateless. And I think it builds on many British stereotypes about Asian women, but it also becomes a very effective way to kind of negotiate the housing system in Britain. The point you made about the mid-century project of social science, I think, is really interesting, and you're absolutely right that camps are a kind of controlled population. I look in this project also at internment camps during the First World War because, and during the Second World War, because the slippage between being a refugee and an internee is so great, right? So some of the Jews who enter in the 30s get interned again in the late 30s and early 40s. So they stay in refugee camps for one period of time, and then they get kind of swept up into internment and stay there as well. And there is a lot of certainly British leftist concern about these men have just escaped concentration camps in Germany, and now we're re-ensconcing them in something similar here. But social science has an interesting status in this project because I think by the time we get to the Ugandan Asians, the camp is both a site of experimentation and repository of knowledge for social scientists, but social science itself public confidence in social science has begun to fracture by the early 70s as well. So it's seen as a place to correct certain mistakes, but it doesn't have the kind of absolute public power that it might have had in the 40s and 50s. So you can see the kind of rise and fall of expertise in many ways in the project too. And thanks for all of those interesting questions. I think there was another hand over here. Oh, yeah.
Great presentation. Thanks so much. Ben Hopkins, I teach at GW. Two quick questions. One to go off my colleague Alana's question. On the Anglo-Egyptians, you were talking about how they refer to themselves as evacuees. A comment/question. That's also how Indians, South Asians were talked about in the wake of partition. It was the evacuee property, custodian, et cetera. So I wonder if there's an imperial dimension that might be there. And then secondly, I wonder if the epilogue of the book maybe is about how refugee and refugee resettlement camps become the 21st century asylum seeker and detention camps. And if you could talk about that.
Yes, so the epilogue is all about what happens to these spaces after the refugees leave them. That is exactly right. And I think there's an interesting prehistory to these spaces as well as an afterlife of them. So, one thing that's really interesting about these army bases and Air Force bases too is that they have their own very complicated relationship with local communities, right? So places where let's say Ugandan Asians, these 16 bases where the Ugandan Asian camps, or what are turned into Ugandan Asian camps, it's not like they are blank spaces that Britons have no impression of. Britons have had a very complicated, at least for several decades, relationship to these bases and see them either as sites of militarization, they see them as having affected rural life in different ways. They often see them as sites of American power or outposts of American power. So the refugees in some sense kind of inherit that history and that way that locals hate or take pleasure in or think of themselves in relation to these camps. Once the refugees are moved out, they really do become part of a broader history of detention, and I think that's a very interesting history. I mean, some of them are turned into schools or hospitals, so they're not all turned into prisons, but most of them are divided between ordinary prisons and detention centers for illegal immigrants, and some of them remain so today. So I will address that in the epilogue, but I also think it's such a big and interesting question that I think that's probably going to be my next book, is exactly illegal detention centers, or detention centers for illegals, and some of the detention centers themselves are illegal too, so I think that's next up. Thank you.
We'll stop it there, but please join me in thanking Jordanna.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.